Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Great to have you. Hope you've had a good EdPalooza so far. My name is Tom Vander from Getting Smart. I'm here to host a terrific panel today. We're talking about connecting the dots between the science of learning, human potential, practice, and policy. So you're going to see today we're going to toggle back and forth between great school practices and how those connect to policy. Allow me to introduce an all-star panel. Let me start with Dr. Pamela Cantor. She's the founder and now senior scientist at Turnaround for Children, a nationally and internationally known expert, particularly on the subject of trauma. She built an organization that is now the leading insight engine that draws insights from all of the sciences of learning and development. And we're really glad to have her talk about the sciences of learning. Dr. Cantor, welcome.
Thank you, Tom.
We're also joined by LeeAnne Cornyn. She's the director of Children's Initiative in Ohio Governor Mike DeWine's office. LeeAnne, it's great to have you with us.
Likewise, thanks.
And up first today is a principal from a fantastic EL school in Washington, D.C., Laina Cox. Laina is the principal at Capital City Charter School. It's an amazing K-12 school just north of the nation's capital. It's part of a national network that is great at making the community the classroom. And Laina is going to kick us off today by describing ways in which they really take the whole child into account and really bring the community into the classroom and bring the classroom into the community. Laina, it's so great to have you with us today. Maybe you could give us a summary of what a good day looks like at Capital City.
So thank you for having me. And yes, I am the principal. I'm the middle school principal at Capital City. And you know, it's funny because a good day for us hasn't changed since we have shifted into distance learning, because a good day for us is a day that we have connected and engaged with our students and maintained our sense of community. And we are still doing that. We're just doing that from squares on a Zoom screen now. But you know, we are a community-based program, and we were founded 20 years ago by parents in the district, and we really held to that family engagement being our mission, and knowing just how important our families are as stakeholders. And just what that looks like. And that has become that much more important and that much more critical since the pandemic and since us having to shift to a virtual setting. And so, you know, a lot of times I get asked, like, what are our kind of like secret ingredients? Like, what does powerful learning look like? And I think it falls into, you know, just a couple of buckets. It's really around ensuring positive school culture through, you know, building a system of support and having relationships. So much of who we are is built around community and relationships, and it lives with what we consider our heartbeat, which is our crew. So that's our version of an advisory in EL education. So it's about 10 to 12 students in a crew. And once we had to shift to distance learning, crew became the most important thing for us back in the spring. That was how we ensured that we didn't lose track of any students, that we knew where they were, what was going on, how they were feeling. And when we created the schedule for the fall and the winter, we designed it around crew. So now we start our day with crew, and we expect our teachers to essentially read the Zoom the way that they would read the room upon students entering for arrival.
Cool.
Yeah, and then we end our day with crew now.
All right, Laina, let me interrupt you and give a big plug for this new book, We Are Crew. This was just published by eleducation.org. about 6 weeks ago. This is really the best guidebook on how to run an advisory system that's out there. It's a detailed guidebook on how to set up and lead an advisory system. One of the cool things is that it's backed up by a beautiful set of videos on the EL site that are free to anybody that's interested. We'd love to have you check that out. My colleague Mason has added a podcast that Laina did. Laina's been on both the 180 podcast, that's Pam's podcast, and also Getting Smart. So we really appreciate CREW. It's both an idea, it's a culture, and it's a structure at EL schools. Laina, I'd love to have you, Pam's organization, Turnaround for Children, recently released a set of tiered supports that I think are a beautiful and detailed picture of how to support kids in a structured way. Maybe you could talk about that at Capital City. How do you identify and meet student needs, and how do you back teachers up so that when they spot a situation where they might need more help than a teacher can provide, how do you support both learners and teachers in a tiered support system?
Yeah, I mean, a tiered support system is really critical because it allows us to catch things at a base level and really be able to get to the root of what might be going on with a student. And so we use, response to intervention, the RTI process. We use this concept of really finding evidence-based interventions, and then using the student's response to those interventions as a basis for determining instructional needs and the intensity with which we follow through. So in our process, we literally have a Google form that teachers can fill out to essentially flag a concern. This is coming up for us in class. This is what we're seeing with a student. And this includes types of interventions that they've tried, communication that they've had with families, and a smaller team made up of myself, other administrators and counselors, really then kind of read through that and try and determine what could be some of those issues. That student is then assigned someone to follow up to get more details and information from the teacher. And then if we notice that we're still seeing issues, we then move it to the next level, which is more of like a student support team. That includes our reading specialists, our math specialists, administrators, again, our counselor, our director of student services, just bringing in more voices to really thinking about and being able to do that root cause analysis to determine what the issue could be and how best to support, and then who is needed to support. And so when I was talking about at the beginning around our CREW and our community and relationship building, this process only works with relationships, because you can't flag to identify or support a student that you don't know. And so it's another reason why we invest so much in relationships and our student social emotional learning, because once a student reaches student support level or child study or any of those tiered supports, we have rich data that isn't just solely quantitative, but deeper, multi-dimensional qualitative data to really then figure out how to best support that student and provide whatever resources and supports now that we can provide to the teachers.
Dr. Cantor, does that sound like a well-developed system of tiered support?
That sounds like a really, really, really best case example. And I love the fact that you grounded it all in deeply knowing students and knowing them in many different kinds of ways. Yes, that's the A+ example.
Laina, I wrote a book earlier this year called The Power of Place, which is about place-based learning. You're in the nation's capital, and you have such a rich, if you think about community as classroom, what better place could there be than than Northwest Washington, D.C., where you go a little bit north and you're in the woods and the creeks, and you go a little bit south and you're in the nation's capital. Maybe give us an example of how you try to take advantage of your local setting to create powerful experiences for kids.
Absolutely. So, our fifth graders, so in EL education, we do things called expeditions. And our fifth graders expedition is called Get Out the Vote. And so
very timely.
Right, perfect timing, right? So they learn parts of government, the Constitution, understanding historical context to voting and the right to vote. We're obviously in the nation's capital, so the places that they can visit, the connections that they can have are amazing, but they're 10. They're 10 years old. They won't necessarily engage with any of that unless they can connect to it.
Right.
So our shift in this expedition is also to teach them what taxation without representation means, knowing that they live in a city that's fighting for statehood. So, to understand voting rights and the Constitution and all of these things that apply, let's bring it home to them and let them see what that actually feels like to live in DC. And that's relevant, it's connecting. And so when they're working on their service learning component of the expedition, which for us is creating content to convince people to vote. So in previous years, when the outside was open and we weren't dealing with COVID-19, they were out in the streets trying to get people to vote. They were marching on college campuses, having students sign pledges, promising that they would vote since the fifth graders couldn't. This year, they did a series of Get Out to Vote videos that we shared broadly. But they're just more connected to why voting is so important in the district. Yeah.
I really love that. That sense of identity and connection that they create with these place-based projects. LeeAnne, as Ohio's director of Children's Initiative, I imagine you get to visit schools frequently.
Yes, quite a few.
You have lots of great schools right there in Metro Columbus. One of our favorites is a trauma-informed school called Highland Elementary. When you visit a place like Highland, what do you see that makes you think it's a positive place for kids?
Sure. So just as a little bit of context, from a state level perspective, how Ohio got to being so invested and focused on creating trauma-informed schools and building out the tiered supports in districts that our kids need. Ohio really has been kind of battling a different epidemic for the past decade, and that's the opioid epidemic. We were sort of ground zero for the pill mills in the early 2000s, and tragically, even 2 decades later today, we still lose thousands of people every single year to unintentional opioid overdoses. The vast majority of those folks, unfortunately, are really sort of in their peak childbearing and childrearing years, 25 to 44 years old. So we know that this epidemic is really disproportionately impacting families, and it's really disproportionately impacting our kids. So in Ohio, about half of our 2.3 million kids have experienced one adverse childhood experience, and 1 in 7 have 3 or more. So we know that our schools are sort of inheriting some of the collateral damage of this epidemic, and business as usual just isn't going to work anymore. So as Attorney General, my boss really started sort of touring the state, trying to find schools that were doing things a little bit differently and creatively to meet the needs of their kids. And that's how we stumbled across Highland Elementary. It's a completely trauma-informed school in the Hilltop neighborhood of Columbus. The Hilltop is one of our highest overdose hotspot communities in Columbus. This particular elementary school is also sort of a feeder school from one of our largest domestic violence shelters. So certainly our children have seen quite a bit who attend Highland Elementary. It was a school that historically was very underperforming and, had a lot of disruptions in the classroom, whether that's, cheers, meltdowns, getting thrown, you name it. But you walk in there today and it's brightly colored hallways with murals that were painted by the students themselves. You see students who really understand how to evaluate and are taught how to evaluate their feelings and really identify when they are at a tipping point. Our teachers and counselors work with them to teach breathing and meditation practices so that kids know how to calm themselves when they're getting into that red zone. When that's not enough really to calm them, they've got the opportunity to excuse themselves to a sensory room or a sensory space within their own classroom. And these are areas that have sort of softer lighting, maybe trampolines and exercise balls or some other kind of sensory object. Many times there are certified counselors in these sensory rooms that can work with kids on unpacking, their feelings and why they're feeling that way. It's not uncommon, I think, during direct instruction for us to have kids sort of up and walking the classroom, maybe laying on the carpet. They're not sitting in perfect rows like, we might have in my classroom. And then there's yoga and meditation anytime kids come in from recess, because we know that the teachers there have learned that can be a bit of a trigger for kids. So I think for some policymakers, when they walk into schools like this, it can look chaotic. It can look like there's a lot of time being taken from direct instruction, and how can kids possibly learn in these kinds of environments? So I think it's really important for, school leaders, district leaders, to really help elected officials understand the brain science behind why all of these things actually help support and enhance learning and can help our kids grow academically even more.
Thank you, LeeAnne. I also want to give a shout out to Metro, a really terrific early college high school on the Ohio State campus. Another really great example of a whole child high school design with active learning focused on STEM, and where learners are challenged to bridge over to classes on the Ohio State campus. I'm going to say another word about Metro because it's just a nationally important school that I think is another great high school example of what you just described.
Yeah, so Metro is an incredible school. It's a highly diverse school. We have kids coming from all over the city of Columbus, but it's also a huge feeder school for many of our suburban communities as well. And students are taught the scientific method and how to apply that to everyday challenges. They have a competition every single year to solve one kind of big societal issue. So whether that's the opioid epidemic, which it has been in the past, or infant mortality, they're tackling the challenges that they face every single day in their communities, and they're applying their learning to their real lives. So it's an incredible school that really brings the community in, and it brings the kids into the community as well.
It does, and it's another great example of active learning and really strong supports in a diverse by design school. So another school we appreciate. Dr. Cantor, could you summarize the science of learning and development that's behind the experiences that we've just heard about?
Well, I have to start by saying that the examples that LeeAnne and Laina are giving us are really gorgeous examples of how to use the knowledge that we have today about stress, about brain development, and about what we know about the relationship between learning and kids developing that capacity to self-soothe, to regulate, and how important the human relationship is in bringing this about. You know, before the pandemic, before COVID-19 and the events of this last year, if I had had the opportunity to talk to you about human development, the development of the brain, and learning science, I would have begun with this: that each of us has roughly 20,000 genes in our human genome. Yet in our lifetime, fewer than 10% of these genes will ever be expressed. So what do you think determines what's in that 10%? It's context, the environments, the experiences, and the relationships in our lives. Think about the examples that we've just heard as I say this to you, because the context we're exposed to is the primary driver of who we become, including the expression of our genes. So the risks and the opportunities in development and learning sit inside this one profoundly important point, that there is no separation between nature and nurture, biology and environment, brain and behavior, only a collaboration between them. So if nurture drives nature, there's both good and bad news in that. It means that our brains are a living structure made up of tissue that is the most susceptible to change from experience of any tissue in the human body. I want to say that again. The brain is a living structure made up of tissue that is the most susceptible to change from experience of any tissue in the human body. So we're in a moment now with COVID-19, the nationwide protests and violence, and huge disparities in the hardships people are experiencing, where no one can feel fully safe and secure, but Black and brown children and their families rightly feel more threatened than others, and trust, which was already fragile, is broken in many places where those who are supposed to protect us don't, won't, or can't. That 1 in 3 parents of infants and toddlers are skipping and reducing meals. That 4,200 children in New York have lost a parent. That over 9 million students do not have access to broadband. And that all of this, including COVID, are concentrated in low-income communities. These are powerful indicators of the injustices of today and the risks to health and academic growth that they carry. The hardships have been inequitable, and families have been living with this kind of stress and insecurity for now over 8 months. And then there is the unique paradox in this time of COVID, and that is that to keep ourselves physically safe, we've had to be physically distant from the important people in our lives. COVID has disrupted the crucial connections to teachers, to friends, to family members, the very connections we need to feel safe, to manage stress and fear, and to build our resilience. So I want to give you a primer on the science of stress that explains what we're seeing when trust and safety are broken and our bodies and our minds are seized by stress. And as you hear this, again, think about the examples that LeeAnne and Laina spoke about, because we have to talk about the biology of stress and what it does to us, and in particular, what it does to the structures of the limbic system, which is the learning and emotion center of the brain. We know that stress is the most common naturally occurring example of negative context, that when we experience stress, cortisol is released through our brains and our bodies, and it produces that familiar feeling of fight, flight, and freeze. It's intense when it happens, but if the stress is mild or tolerable, it's adaptive. It makes us alert and sharp. It helps us prepare for an event or a test. This is our limbic system at work: attention, concentration, focus, memory, preparation. But when children have persistently high levels of stress, and that stress is not buffered by the presence of a trusted and calm adult, something else can happen. Children can get locked in that fight or flight feeling where it just won't let up. And this is the condition we call toxic stress. Cortisol can do a lot of harm to the structures of the limbic system because adversity doesn't just happen to children. It happens inside their brains and bodies through the biologic mechanism of stress. But fortunately, that's not the end of the story. There's a big upside when we turn to another hormone, the hormone oxytocin. This is the hormonal system that produces feelings of trust, love, safety, and attachment. And that's not all. Oxytocin hits the same structures in the brain as cortisol. Yet oxytocin is the more powerful hormone because it can literally protect children at the level of the cell from the damaging effects of cortisol. Relationships that are strong and positive cause the release of oxytocin. And this not only helps children manage stress, it offsets the damaging effects of cortisol and it produces resilience to future stress. In fact, the human relationship and oxytocin are the most powerful example we have of positive context. So there are only three things you have to remember about brain development: the astounding malleability of the human brain, experience-dependent growth, and the role of context. And because of this, there is no such thing as a developing child independent of context. And it is this single point that carries the enormous opportunity we have and explains what is so powerful about the examples that Laina and LeeAnne have given us.
Dr. Cantor, just to connect some dots here, you and I are both deeply concerned about the millions of kids that are disconnected from school today and the millions more that are accumulating failing grades and as a result are at risk of becoming disconnected from school. I imagine there's a connection there between this disconnection, both academic and physical, and the stress that you were just talking about. Is that right?
The social isolation of this time has taken a big toll, and we all know that, but nowhere is this more visible and more significant than with adolescents. Adolescents rely on friends to navigate pressure, manage anxiety and stress, feel a sense of self-worth, and experience trust. And one of the biggest myths about adolescence is that it's about wanting to be totally independent, especially from adults, when the real story is that teens crave relationship and they want to broaden their relationship to adults, including and perhaps especially adults outside their families. Today, young Americans are increasingly battling COVID-19 while experiencing this kind of social isolation and the loss of connections, the loneliness, the emotional vulnerability in record numbers. A nationwide survey of high school and college-age students found that 50% are worried about their own mental health, and at least 25% are aware of someone who is thinking or speaking about suicide. Less than half feel that their schools and their communities are offering sufficient mental health support to them. And all of this, when you spoke about connecting the dots, all of this makes more understandable the seriousness of the risk of disconnection and disengagement from school and learning that we see today. According to Bellwether Education, 3 million of the most educationally marginalized students in our country have not received any education, virtual or in person, since March. And according to the New York Times, disengagement has been especially high in poorer communities, including many urban school systems. In LA, for example, which is the nation's second largest school system, a quarter of the students were not logging in May. So today, trust is very fragile and human connections of all kinds have been disrupted. And this has huge implications for how young people manage and surmount stress. And I just want to mention the many faces of stress. It can show up at the mild end as fatigue and physical unwellness. It can show up as depression and anxiety. It can show up as greater risk-taking behavior, like what LeeAnne was talking about. And it can show up as disengagement from learning because of a loss of a sense of purpose or a belief in being able to have a future. This is now emerging as a crisis for this age group, and the environments that you are hearing about, the kind that Laina spoke about with Crew, the kind that LeeAnne spoke about in this trauma-informed school, are environments designed for relationships, engagement, and connections. And those also have to be supported with a dramatic increase in mental health supports.
Laina, I want to give you a chance to respond to Dr. Cantor. I imagine that it for you highlights some of the things that you do really well that counter stress, because your model really focuses on creating belonging and attachment and support. So what were you thinking about as Dr. Cantor described the situation, and maybe give us positive examples of how Capital City is trying to support kids in a tough period?
Yeah, I mean, it was hard to hear. I think, being a school leader during this time, we're so focused on right now what's going on in our building, what's going on, like how we are engaging our students, following up with them, finding them, staying on top of them. Our students complained about us before COVID that we do too much. And so they didn't know anything until we got to COVID, and they really saw us do too much, down to, we're texting them, we're finding out when we left in March, when we knew that we were closing, for any students we knew who had cell phones, we asked them for their phone numbers. And like silly teenagers, like they gave it to us. And so, we started texting them. Like if you weren't showing up and we couldn't find you, like we were texting them. We were on their social media. Did they post recently? All of these different things to just try and stay connected. But it's been such this balance of the pressure to how we're going to close these academic COVID gaps that we're going to face for the next couple of years after this. But the critical point being, it's not just about academics right now. Everything that Dr. Cantor was saying about the relationship piece and just the mental, the malleability of the brain and just the mental connection and developmentally, especially like I work with middle schoolers. This is the time where everything about them is there's a social aspect to it. And so one of the things that we've just really had to do, and we spent a lot of time over the summer doing this. In the spring, we were in crisis mode. We shut down. None of us were prepared for this. None of us had taken courses in graduate school to prepare to lead a school through a global pandemic. I guarantee you there will be classes now in programs, but we weren't prepared for this. So in the spring, it was just a lot of us kind of trying to juggle in piecemeal. Over the summer, because we knew we were returning in distance learning and we knew we were going to start the year this way, we spent time over the summer trying to think about what are the areas and the ways that we connect with our students in person and the ways that we build community and that we find, we bring the social aspects. What were those things that were our strongest? And how are we going to make that virtual? And we spent time over the summer thinking specifically and tangibly, how do we take these, small traditions and things that, that we do and that we take for granted, and how do we make that virtual? And so we now host this event called First Fridays, and it's a way to get all of our kids together on Zoom the first Friday of each month. Last month, it was a big game night. And it's different students that you wouldn't necessarily think would show up. But they're looking for that connection. They want to see us as much as, they act like they don't like us sometimes. They show up, and they want to see the adults in their school and other students. So things like that, ways to bring the students together. We've recreated spaces that normally we would fuss at them if they were hanging out. So like there's a hallway at dismissal when I'm just trying to get kids out the building. Under normal circumstances, we had a grade level team that now hosts hallway dismissal time, and the kids just show up for Zoom and just go hang out the way that they would during the school year. And so we've just tried to recreate the physical spaces where we could in a virtual world, and some of the other structures and whole school things that we would normally do together, or things that the crews are connecting and staying, compete, fun competitions and all of those types of things. So, for us, I say this to my students all the time. I have no idea what it feels like to be a middle school student during a global pandemic. So a lot of times we're always saying, oh, we've been there. We've been in middle school. Not one adult has any idea what it feels like to be 12, 13, 16 years old in a global pandemic. And so listening to our students, I've done a lot more listening this year than over the past few months than I had done in my whole career. Listening to my students, what are you looking for? What do you need? What can we do for you? Listening to my teachers, how are we going to get you through this? How are we going to sustain? Listening to my families, what can we do to support you during this time? We know it's a struggle. We know you have X many students, you're working, they're on 3 different computers, 3 different schedules. What can we do? So I hold family listening sessions. I hold focus groups with students. We hold meetings with teachers. Those are the types of things that are just so significant right now, and they may seem small, but it's for us, it's what has allowed us to feel successful in a time that just feels dark and gloomy.
You made us smile. We really appreciate that's a great leadership example at a time when people need trust, they need compassion, they need empathy, understanding. They need that sense of belonging and connection, and we deeply appreciate that you're doing that. LeeAnne, I want to turn our attention to public-private partnerships and education and health partnerships. At the outset, I want to say that I think we've seen a national failure as far as the public health response goes to this pandemic. It's been sad to watch the lack of coordination between local and state and federal resources by and large. I discussed this with Dr. Asif Bitton from the Ariadne Center at Harvard last week in a podcast. But what we did agree on is that in many communities and in many states around the country, there have been really productive partnerships between schools and health providers, and between schools and mental health providers, and that may be one of the lasting benefits from this crisis is a new web of supports for children and families. You've seen some of that in Ohio. Maybe you could describe some of the productive partnerships that have developed that could have lasting benefit for families.
Sure. So I think many Ohio school districts were very similar to Laina, at the beginning of the pandemic, really just trying to limp to the end of the academic year so that they could have a quick pause, pull themselves back together and develop a lot of those really critical community-based partnerships that ultimately would sustain them throughout the rest of the calendar year. I think that for better or worse, really this pandemic has crystallized that no single system can support the needs of the whole child on their own. So we are having, even school districts that historically have been incredibly independent and not felt like they needed to reach into their community, actively engaging community partners. I think Ohio was in a very fortunate position because our current biennial budget included a brand new funding line called Student Wellness and Success that required schools to partner with at least one other community-based partner, whether that's a local health district, a hospital, community-based behavioral health provider, some other entity, a mentoring group, to implement one of 11 eligible wraparound support services, which could include things like school-based physical and mental health services, supports for foster and homeless youth, family engagement programs, community liaisons, all sorts of different critical supports that our kids need. So we have seen some great success with that in Ohio by incentivizing and funding those strategic partnerships. During the 2019-2020 school year, which was really the first year that this funding fully rolled out, Ohio's 610 school districts implemented more than 3,000 different initiatives, and they partnered with 1,600 different community partners to do that. Of those partnerships, though, I think only about 80 were with local health departments, and I think now I'd have to venture and guess that every single one of our superintendents has their local public health director on speed dial. In fact, some of our suburban school districts in the greater Cleveland area are doing weekly sit downs with their health commissioners. And I don't think that those were happening a year ago. And certainly we know that those sorts of relationships will go far beyond just the physical health pandemic of COVID-19. And hopefully they can, begin to blossom into things like, behavioral health prevention, and other community level issues. So ultimately, I think that COVID has enhanced these local partnerships. It's highlighted opportunities for new one. I think Pam talked about the importance of broadband and access to internet. We know that can lead to social isolation and reduction of opportunities. Ohio is an incredibly diverse state. We have 32 Appalachian counties all along our eastern and southern border in Ohio. So not something I think people really expect out of Ohio, but certainly these communities, because of geography and opportunity, lack access to reliable high-speed internet. And really this pandemic has brought our internet service providers to the table. And they're now really stepping up to support our districts to better connect our students. At the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of our kids were sort of crowding into library parking lots and their school parking lots to pick up the free Wi-Fi. And through this new innovative partnership, we've been able to deploy more one-to-one technology, create more access to internet, to really create those opportunities for kids to come together, not only to learn, but also to engage in telehealth. We've been able to really deploy and redirect a lot of our community-based behavioral health providers to deliver services through telehealth. So now this is opening up an entire world of opportunities for our kids, not just academically, but socially, emotionally, and behaviorally as well. So I'll close for the folks who are in the audience that are policymakers and just say that, I think the pandemic has really highlighted the critical importance of these relationships. But I will say, I know that no one really has spare change in their couch cushions right now, but even a little bit of funding can really go a long way to incentivize these partnerships and help sustain them. So I'll stop there.
Dr. Cantor, can you say more about the supports that should be in place for children and families?
Yes, Tom, I want to highlight one thing. You and I were part of a fireside chat yesterday with Jim Shelton, and I talked about the time with the support of CZI that we were able to bring together a synthesis of the science of learning and development. And what that synthesis helped us see is that there are ways to use that science which tells a fundamentally optimistic story about what's possible for children. When I speak about context-driving development, the fundamental malleability of children to experience, this is an optimistic story. And now with that roadmap in the science, and you're hearing in Laina's example, in LeeAnne's example, people who are using it today, that we know that we can build environments in our classrooms, our schools and communities, and even our homes that restore connection powerfully and help our young people cope with stress, build resilience, and re-engage in learning all at the same time. But the science of learning and development calls for us to design schools and learning environments mapped to the way children learn and the way the brain grows. Today, we know that a healthy context for learning requires attention to young people's safety, their health, their mental health, their social, emotional, and cognitive development, their academic skills and identity and agency, and not some of these things, all of them together. In the story that LeeAnne just talked about, it's a story that schools can't do this alone. They're nested inside communities. And these services that have operated historically in silos can't operate in silos anymore. We need a whole child design that actually combines 5 elements. And you've heard them in Laina's story: positive developmental relationships, environments filled with safety and belonging, rich, engaging, relevant learning experiences, the development of the full set of 21st century building block skills, the mindsets and habits that all successful learners have, and integrated supports organized as tiered supports to meet the specific needs of each and every child. When I describe that, you've heard that in what Laina described about her school, because the development of a whole child emerges when we combine these elements in experiences that connect to one another. Picture a web of experiences, because this is how our brains actually develop. Lots of connections between brain structures, and it's these connections that produce increasingly complex skills, whether we're talking about solving a complex math problem, writing a composition, or building resilience. And the development of a whole child is a continuum that begins in early childhood. It actually begins before birth, which means that development and learning are happening all the time, everywhere, at home, in community settings, and at schools. Imagine if all of these settings were rich in relationships, designed to optimize skill and competency development, designed for learning and growth. I think every one of you knows that historically, there's been a false choice in education between the things we need to do on social and emotional development, physical and mental health, and the pursuit of academic excellence. Laina just spoke about that, about this time. But not today, because the neurobiologic story here is simple. The brain is malleable. As we said, it's the tissue in the human body that's the most susceptible to change from experience of any tissue in the human body. And a brain under stress is shut down. It can't focus well and concentrate, and it has little working memory, and it can be easily triggered by emotions. And the way our brains are wired, it's our emotions that drive our cognitive and learning skills. It's our emotions that engage us or shut us down. So today, in this time of COVID, of the violence, the racism, and the extreme inequity, we have no choice. The path to a calm classroom is a calm brain. The path to learning is a calm brain. And the path to a calm brain is to prioritize activities that build relationships, establish solid routines, and promote resilience. What we're calling today the new 3 R's. And all of them are drawn from the non-negotiables for whole child design that we've been talking about.
LeeAnne, what would you suggest for the policymakers listening in if they wanted to advance a whole child agenda in their state?
Well, first and foremost, I think visiting Pam's website to learn more about the brain science of adverse childhood experiences and toxic stress and the impact that
turnaroundusa.org.
There we go. Yes, exactly.
It's all open source, LeeAnne.
You know, I'm very fortunate that I work for a governor who has sort of dug into the brain science to try to understand what we can do at a state level to support schools that are really designing programs to meet the social and emotional needs of their kids. So for those that may not have that kind of leader in their state, my best advice is really to become that leader, to just start working on it, whether you're the right policymaker or not. Simply putting in the time, creating the opportunity to move this work forward is really important and powerful. And I don't think that most people would think of their state attorney general as the key leader in a whole child movement within their state. But when he was attorney general, Mike DeWine, my boss, he was one of the few state leaders really talking about the importance of social and emotional development. And he took the opportunity when we were in the AG's office to really push that work forward and advance it. In fact, we were able to publish 2 different reports on the importance of drug use prevention education and wraparound supports in schools. So I'm pulling up a few slides right now. So this is one of them, the Drug Use Prevention Resource Guide, which we created to really sort of walk schools through the strategic planning framework and how they can plan and develop wraparound supports. Around the same time, our State Board of Education also started some really pivotal work on school-based health. They created a school-based health toolkit. They also started working on social emotional learning standards. And at the same time, they embarked on a new strategic planning process that focused on the whole child and included social emotional learning as one of its 4 key learning domains, which I think was pretty revolutionary in the state at the time. You know, and even though it wasn't a priority of the General Assembly at the time or the previous administration, they still continued to advance this work. And we are so much better off. You know, our administration is so much better off having the good fortune of inheriting the foundation of this incredible work across the state. And it really helped us when we rolled out our new whole child funding model called Student Wellness and Success, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, which was a $675 million fund that every single school district and public charter school in the state received a portion of to build up wraparound supports for their kids. So we also created something called Healthy Student Profiles to help our school districts design the right services and supports that their students need. This was an incredible data matching project between the Department of Medicaid and Education that created individualized profiles for school districts about the physical and behavioral health needs of their kids. It includes aggregate data on things like the number of children within their district that have a mental health diagnosis or diabetes or asthma, the number of kids who haven't been to one of their wellness visits. So they know what the needs of their kids are and they can design appropriate interventions. We were able to couple these investments with some additional funding for universal prevention education, as well as trauma-informed training for educators. And really the goal was to create resources that help schools establish a tiered system of supports for kids and families. So I see prevention education as the absolute foundational element in the room. We have to help our kids develop the right skills so that they can manage their emotions and respond to the environments that they're in. And then we worked on pushing out some trauma-informed training to our educators so that they could do exactly what Laina's teachers are doing every single day, which is developing those deep, meaningful relationships with students and then referring them on to other experts if they feel like there's something going on. And then finally, those student wellness and support and success funds can be used to create those higher tiered supports and interventions that kids need when tiers 1 and 2 just aren't cutting it. Really what's so great about our whole child framework is I feel like it pulls all of this together with a nice, neat little bow. And a really critical part of this work was pulling together a broad-based group of stakeholders. Engaging them in the process of creating our whole child framework was critical. And I think that every state really needs to have more than just education at the table when they're developing a whole child framework. Having that shared vision, that shared playbook across systems is absolutely critical to making sure that this is successful. And what I love the most about this picture is you see that the school wraps around the child, but then you see those community partnerships wrap around the school. And I think it solidifies that this is not just one more thing that school districts have to do by themselves. This is a community that must support its children. They're everybody's kids and everybody has a responsibility to support them. And I just want to close by saying one thing that Pam touched on briefly before, and that's if we're starting all of this work at age 5, we're starting it way too late. We really have to, we've missed an entire critical developmental period, probably the most important developmental period, and that's really 0 to 3. So we also have been advancing some prenatal to 5 programming, things like expanding evidence-based home visiting, improving the quality of our childcare settings, and hopefully expanding access to more families And then we've also adopted statewide the Dolly Parton Imagination Library to make sure that any child under the age of 5 gets a free book every single month to focus on early literacy. And that just helps our kids get to kindergarten healthy and resilient.
Thanks, LeeAnne. Those are great resources. I want to give a shout out to 2 more terrific Ohio organizations that you know well that are nationally important. One is Battelle for Kids. As a next step, if you're a community leader, hosting a community conversation about what kids should know and be able to do and what kind of supports they need to be successful. Battelle for Kids has been doing that in hundreds of communities around the United States. They've compiled their work in a great resource called Portrait of a Graduate that is a gallery of the community conversations about what kids should know and be able to do and what kind of supports need to be in place. Another one is that's in Columbus and in Cincinnati is KnowledgeWorks Foundation, knowledgeworks.org, another great resource on the whole child agenda. Laina, for the school leaders that are out there, parting words of advice, what should they do? Where should they start? Probably visit Capital City as soon as possible.
Right, when the outside is open, everyone can come to Capital City.
What else?
No, I think one of the things that read the book, right? Read We Are Crew, watch those videos, and check out eleducation.org and find the schools that are in your state that belong to the network. Now, I think the other thing that I would just add that I haven't really honed in on and mentioned, I've talked a lot about the community and our students, but I would be, remiss if I didn't really name the intentionality behind the adults that we bring into our building, and the importance of, anyone who is standing in front of our students, anyone who is leading our school. These have to be people who truly care about students, but not just through their words and action, but through their own learning. So, our staff is required to participate in professional development around equity and anti-racist work. And, there can only be but so much trust and community building and all of that, unless teachers are doing that work for themselves too. And so that's so critical, because unless you're committed to that, none of the other things that we've talked about are going to mean anything, because it's not the bringing the full person of who you are standing in front of students. And so it's really just important for me to say, if schools don't do more to make adults interrogate their own biases, their own prejudices, we're going to continue to be in a state of abandon of what, our children really need and who needs to be standing in front of them and leading schools for them. And Dr. Cantor mentioned, this as well, just the increased racial tensions that we've been going through at a time where we're in a global pandemic, and we're also living through a racial epidemic, continue to live through a racial epidemic in this country. The times where we would normally physically be with students to help them with the questions they have, the feelings, the concerns, all of those things, we're not physically with them right now. And so it's still so important to figure out ways to build that trust and to show our students that we're doing this work as well. And so in order to have these communities and to be able to do that and have this space that we've talked about and that LeeAnne talked about, it was important for me to still make that statement around adults and the teachers and the staff and the administrators really taking an inner look and being honest and real about bringing that work into any school building that is trying to build up children.
Thank you. That was a great set of closing thoughts. Pam, is there a whole child benediction that you can leave us with on the way out? Any parting thoughts on where we should start our next conversation?
Well, yes, indeed. We can start with the mind-blowing insight that context and relationships grow the brain, trigger the expression of our genes, harness the brain's astonishing malleability to unleash the potential in each and every child. We can ask and we can answer the same question that researchers in many other fields have asked. What can we do that will work optimally for this child in this context? And it is that question that gets you to fundamentally different answers about the way our schools and our education system of the future needs to be designed. This is a really, really optimistic message that if we use the levers of human development such that what one child can do, nearly all children can do under highly favorable conditions, this is our school of the future. And you've heard examples. I'm so struck by the examples that LeeAnne has given us at every level of the system, and Laina has given us at the level of the child. So that's the benediction. It can be done. It is happening in these places, and we just have to scale it and get it to many, many more places.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cantor. Laina Cox from Capital Cities. Every school in America could use one of you. You're awesome. LeeAnne Cornyn. Every state needs a LeeAnne. Thank you for your leadership in Ohio. What a terrific panel. Thank you very much. A great way to wrap up EdPalooza. Take care, everybody. Be safe.
Thank you. Thanks to my co-panelists. Bye.
Thank you all.